Good afternoon, everyone. I'd like to welcome all of you to Art for Lunch. I see some familiar faces and some new faces. My name is Patty Petrie-Dees. I'm the Director of Education. I've been asked to introduce our speaker for today. Seth and Leslie are in Indiana at the Idle-Jorg and having a great time, so I'm going to give a little overview of what's going on at the booth, everything that's coming up from exhibitions to programming, and then we'll get started with Mark. Just want to highlight a few of our exhibitions in our Picturing America gallery. We have our Western Focus, collecting photography. That runs through that was through July 14th. Moving on to Danny Line and the Bike Riders, that opened August 2nd. That's our current exhibition. That runs until January 18th. The West in Focus Women, August 2nd to January 18th. Those are running consecutively side by side in that exhibition. You don't want to miss that. In our temporary gallery, we have our Western costumes from the Silver Screen, the Davy collection. That runs until September 21st. So if you have not seen that, please do. It's closing relatively soon. Also selling the Western movie posters old and new, and that's running until October 26th. In our Borderlands gallery downstairs, we have our Booth Artists Guild annual exhibition until August 10th, and then our Booth Photography Guild annual exhibition opens on August 12th. So lots of things going on in our exhibition galleries and spaces. As far as programming, we'd like to highlight the fact that we have our homeschool programming this month. We have one on September 5th, and we also have one on September 26th for those audiences. We have a big homeschool day on September 18th, so please spread the word. Our sensory-friendly morning is September 28th, and we're moving on to September 11th to highlight our Western movie trivia, which will be happening that night. And we also have our educator night as well. So if you know any educators or anyone that works in the school system, this is a free event celebrating our hardworking educators for the year. So it's an evening of networking, food, and fun for them. That is September 11th from 5 to 8 p.m. And then, of course, we have a concert at the Grand Sons of the Pioneers on September 20th. There's an optional panel discussion in the theater at 11:30 in Bergman Theater and a 12:30 lunch in the ballroom. But the performances are at 2 and 7 p.m., so we encourage you to buy your tickets. Coming up in October, you do not want to miss the Art for Lunch. We have Mark Medley, our curator of photography. He'll be covering our exhibition on Women in the West in the photography gallery, the Picturing America gallery. So please come back for that Art for Lunch. And without further ado, I'd like to introduce our presenter today, Mr. Mark Warren. Mark is an award-winning naturalist, author, composer, Western historian, and owner of Medicine Bow Wilderness School. Mark was also recognized as a 2022 Georgia Author of the Year for his book, Song of the Horseman, in the Literary Fiction finalist. Today, Mark will be giving a presentation titled Nate Champion and the Johnson County War, 1892. Warren's years of research reveal why Western scholars consider Nate Champion to be one of the unsung heroes of American history. So let's find out this information directly from the author, Mr. Mark Warren.
Thank you, Patty. Hello, everybody. I'm very tempted to say at the beginning of this program that you may have a very hard time believing that it's true. But if you follow the news closely these days, I don't think I can say that. What you're about to hear, the historian T.A. Larson said this about it. It is the most notorious event in the history of Wyoming. Another historian, Christopher Knowlton, said, it is the Watergate of Wyoming. And the crazy thing about it is, it's taken a long time for us to know the truth. If you were a researcher and you went to look at old newspapers from that time and place, you would not get the true story. You would have gotten a barrel full of fake news that was manipulated. We all know about the cattle story. Men came home from the Civil War. The Texans who fought for the Confederacy returned home to find their economy a disaster, and they had to face Reconstruction. But you know what was there in the state that had multiplied and multiplied and multiplied was 8 million longhorn steers roaming around the state of Texas. So somebody smart, an entrepreneur, figured out a way to get them up to the railroads. Now, the Intercontinental Railway had been completed in 1869, and it ran, if you look up north from Texas, the closest it came was Nebraska. So as lines ran down from that main line, they approached from the east. In other words, you had them come down to Missouri, and then you had them come down into East Kansas, and then these lines worked their way across Kansas, giving us all these famous names that you see here. All of these towns at one time, in their heyday, they were the biggest thing to happen in the West, because this is where cattle were driven to be shipped off to the east. So it was a huge market. Every cow town became famous in another way, too, because Texans have a very distinct reputation in those days. And when Texans went north to drive these herds, they came into these towns with regular people, and they were ready to celebrate, and they had no respect for the law in many cases. And so the lawman versus the cattleman, that tension developed, and that's just key in our history of the Old West. You know, all of the famous lawmen, many of them dealt with those kinds of herders who came into town and won their reputations that way. What we often forget is that cattle drives had other destinations. There were forts built all over the West to protect the immigrants who were moving across the continent with the dream, their American dream of finding their place and creating a life out west. Whenever you had a fort, you had a couple of things nearby. The Native Americans eventually were defeated and corralled into reservations, which became very shameful residences because it was basically a lot of slums, and there was so much corruption in all of the bureaucracy of the government work of providing them the food. But the food was required of both institutions, reservations and forts. So if you were Texan cattlemen and you got a contract to sell cattle to a certain fort, like this one. This is a drawing of Fort McKinney in northern Wyoming. And you have a town spring up nearby. Now, those towns began as some pretty shady little constructions of entertainment for the soldiers. Soldiers had nothing to do out there. When they were on leave, they could go into these little communities and encounter lots of alcohol, lots of women who were there for that purpose of entertaining those men, gambling dens and opium dens. So it started off with, on the shady side of things, but towns developed. And the town that developed near Fort McKinney, this is an actual photo of Fort McKinney. This is, by the way forts looked in those days. You know, if you grew up watching Rin Tin Tin on TV, you thought all forts were stockades. But it's a loose network of barracks and officers' quarters and mess hall and infirmary and so on. That's the way they looked. So next to Fort McKinney developed the town of Buffalo, Wyoming. And here's what's unusual about Buffalo. Anytime you had neighboring newspapers in different counties, you would always find that one county newspaper would promote itself and would try to speak disparagingly of a neighbor. And this was to encourage people to come to our county to help develop our community, bring more people in. But in the case of Buffalo, the neighboring counties were always complimenting the town of Buffalo. They said that it was a town full of ambitious, good people who wanted to make a healthy place for their children to grow up. And they were people who wanted to develop businesses and get the mercantile going. And they just had a great reputation. And that's unusual in the history of the West to see that. That's another colorized view of Buffalo. That's Clear Creek running through it. Clear Creek runs into the Powder River. So all of this that takes place in this program today is in the Powder River Basin, which is just east of the Bighorn Mountains. So you had this very attractive town drawing you if you were a newcomer, but there was more to draw too. A tremendous amount of good grazing land. This is part of America's Great Plains, and running through between these mountain ranges, you just had grasslands. It's all federal land. Think of it like our national forests are today. Our biggest national forest in Georgia is the Chattahoochee National Forest. I'm plugged right into that with 3 sides national forest on my property. So that's federal land just over the boundary, and the deal was, you are very welcome to graze your cattle on federal land. So that was an attraction. And up on the slopes, you've got all this timber. Timber for making your corrals and barns and fences and other outbuildings and your cabin. You've got all this clean water running off the mountains into the valleys to nourish the grass here. So it's just a wonderful setting to the eye of someone who starts off as a cattle person. Now, one such person who came up from Texas, a 23-year-old young man, was on a cattle drive. He's lived in Texas his whole life. When he came up here and saw this, he must have been smitten with the land, and he decided to stay and build his own spread. And his name was Nate Champion. And I truly believe that Nate Champion should be known by everyone in America. So here we are trying to change that right now. Very few people know who he is, that is, people outside of Western history circles. Everybody in history circles knows this as one of the most impressive young men to have lived in the West. So let me give you a little background on him. His father had been the sheriff of Williamson County, Texas. He had 18 brothers and sisters. He worked on a ranch. And you know, back in those days, you know what your children were, don't you? That was your ranch staff. That's why you had big families, to help run that ranch. So Nate grew up working hard, and he turned out to be a very dependable fellow. This was his reputation. He was smallish, probably about 5'6", maybe 140 pounds. And that was close to average in those days. But he was a little smaller than the average man. Here's how he was known. He was forthright, honest, very friendly, but quiet. He was not the kind of person to initiate the conversation, but once you engaged him, he was very courteous. He had a reputation as being very competent with horses and working cattle. And his mother died when he was 4 years old. His father remarried because it becomes a necessity when you've got a ranch staff of that size. He needed help. So when Nate took off on this cattle drive, along with him came 2 of his younger brothers. Their names were Ben and Dudley. When Nate arrived there and decided to make it on his own, he did what every cowhand did. He had to first raise some money. So he worked for the people who were already there and in charge. And many of these people were from Great Britain. On the left, you see a man who was born in England and moved to Ireland and became a staunch Irish politician. His name was Horace Plunkett. He developed a lung ailment and was advised to move to the dry west of North America. And that's how he got to our famous Old West. Let me tell you his opinion of the Old West. of the Western landscape. He hated it. He hated it almost as much as he hated the people who inhabited it. He saw cowhands as trash. And I'm sure a lot of that just comes from language and probably hygiene, who knows. But that was his opinion of the cowhand. But one cowhand changed his mind, and that was Nate Champion. He hired Nate on his ranch, which was called the Bar C, and there Nate would meet quite a few people who would become important in his life, but Nate worked up to foreman there. So Mr. Plunkett had all kinds of confidence in Nate Champion. We learn most of what we know about Nate by other people's opinions of him. We learn nothing about him from the newspapers, except one example that I'll tell you in just a moment. The next man, Morton Fruin, he was born filthy rich in Sussex, England. And he came to North America for one reason, to trophy hunt in the Yellowstone country with his brother. On their way back, they came through the Powder River Basin. And the dollar signs must have gone off in his head. He saw this as a wonderful setting for a cattle empire. The third man there is also from England. He's from Essex. But he has something very different in the way of his background from these other two gentlemen. Fred Hess was born in poverty. Now, one thing I like about Fred Hess is this. He was greatly swayed by reading the penny dreadfuls and the dime novels that were so popular in that time, that glorified the West and the cowboy and the lawman and the outlaw. And so Fred Hess, at 18 years old, took the ship across the Atlantic and went to Texas to become a Texas cowboy. That's the last good thing I'll say about him. He had the right accent to get along with these guys, and he had the right attitude because he also hated all the cowhands. They considered themselves far above them, and the cowhands learned very quickly to reciprocate that feeling and think of the British as snobs. So Nate works into Mr. Plunkett's range at the Bar C. And here's what no one was able to foresee about this whole story. Bear with me a moment. Put your seatbelts on. This is my sermon. These are three qualities of the human animal that you will find throughout history as being the root cause of some of our more catastrophic events in history. They overstocked. They had way too many cattle in this valley. And why did they do that? Because they saw the grazing range as endless. And they stayed on it for so long before anyone else tried to get started there. They eventually were able to rationalize it and believe that it was theirs. They truly believed that. And that's where you have to put your head in order to understand this story. You know, it's easy to point at these cattle barons and talk about their flaws. But when you consider they truly believed that because they had earned it. They felt like open range was theirs by merit. And they didn't have the ability to look ahead to see what kinds of challenges might come so that they could be ready for it. For example, they didn't work together on this. You might have cattleman A decide to leave this certain pasturage ungrazed for the whole summer so that it would be there for winter. Okay, that's decided. They're not going to touch it. And they go on and go grazing elsewhere. Rancher B comes up and sees this nice piece of pasturage and starts grazing his cattle there. So that winter forage is now gone for cattleman A. So what did they do? to solve the problem of settlers coming in. This is your classic story of the small rancher or the settler coming in and challenging the rights that the cattle barons believed they had. The best Western movie ever made about this little scenario is probably, in my opinion, Shane, one of the great ones. And it's really based on the Johnson County War. So they fenced in any part of it that they wanted to. This would be like me going out a half mile from my home into the national forest and stringing barbed wire. There's one cattleman that I know of who strung 15 square miles of federal land and said, "This is mine." Had no right to do that. If I did that in the national forest, the rangers would be at my door the next day, and I would be in big trouble. I'd be in jail, federal jail. So fencing was one thing, and there were other things that they were going to use to try to solidify their power. And this is a classic story of that kind of abstraction that we hear about of business power. These men had it. They got together and they formed what they called the Wyoming Stock Growers Association. Now that's a long title, so I'll be referring to it as the WSGA. This is an elite club. They actually had a clubhouse in Cheyenne. And these men were so wealthy. And let me read to you some of the titles that they held, members of this organization. We had at least 3 U.S. senators, the Wyoming Territory Treasurer, the Territorial Attorney General, and the governor of the territory. These are all members of this club who want to swing things their way. And they came up with a law because they could legislate anything they wanted to. They had people in power, in place, seated, in the certain legislative assemblies who could get laws passed for them. So it was very biased. There was no question that something would go through when the WSGA introduced it. So they decided to come up with this new law, and the law says this: any cowhand working for one of the cattle barons cannot own any cattle, not one. And if you were found with one on your private place of wherever you kept your cattle, that would have been federal land too, but it would have been a hideout place. If you were caught, then you were blackballed. You were put on a blacklist. You would never be hired by anyone again in the territory. Here's another tool that the WSGA used. They call them stock detectives. You've heard the story before. I'll bet some of you here know about Tom Horn, stock detective. These were licensed assassins. Now, the term stock detective, I feel like that's a fair job. I mean, that was a necessary job. But in addition to that, these men served as killers. And it was just a matter of the WSGA telling them whom they wanted eliminated. This man, Frank Canton, stands out as the number one stock detective and assassin in this area. Everyone who met him commented on his mean eyes. He had no compunctions about taking a man's life, none whatsoever. He was a hard man. His horse there is named Old Fred. And Fred's got some distinct markings on him. Look at those back socks and look at the face markings. He was a very well-known horse, and he's going to play a part in this story because he was very recognizable. He had a reputation as being a horse with a lot of stamina, a trustworthy friend. Now, here's the truth about Frank Canton, And this is something that wasn't known until fairly recently in the terms of history of the West. Frank Canton made himself a celebrity. He wrote books about himself in his older age, and that's one there at the top. And of course, when you read that book, what you are getting a look at is the persona that Frank Canton wanted you to see. What you never learn from his books is that his name was Joe Horner. And in Texas, he rode with the Horner gang as an outlaw. I want to read to you some of his offenses that he was taken to court for. Threatening the life of a lawman, robbing a post office, aggravated assault and battery, cattle theft, murder of a black soldier, and he skated off of that. He didn't pay any penalty for that whatsoever. Robbing a bank. He was finally put in jail, and he broke out. He was caught, and he escaped again. He was caught again, and he escaped again. The next time he was caught, he was indicted, convicted, and sent to the prison in Comanche, Texas. And guess what? He escaped. And he went to Wyoming, changed his name, started a whole new life there, and became Frank Canton. The WSGA came up with a new law. The normal situation had been that if anyone ever came across an unbranded calf, not with its mother, that person who found that calf had permission to take that calf as his own. A calf like that is called a maverick, named after a gentleman named Samuel Maverick. According to the Maverick law, any maverick found on the range belonged only to a WSGA member. So anyone who found it who wasn't a WSGA member was breaking the law in taking that calf as his own. Now this is where things got expanded into a ridiculous misidentification or misdefinition. They said that a non-WSGA member picking up a maverick was a rustler, meaning a thief of cattle. But what they expanded that to was this, that any non-WSGA member was a rustler. So the word rustler was used for a class of people. It had nothing to do with breaking a law. And it became so common that even settlers and small ranchers referred to themselves as rustlers because that meant somebody not in the WSGA. Isn't that odd? So when you read in an old newspaper about who the rustlers were, think of what your understanding of that would be. One of those men who was branded as a rustler because he refused to join the WSGA, the man seated there on the right, that photo, I do have some doubts about this, but it is said from the Wyoming archives that that is Jack Flagg. Jack worked on the Bar C, that is the Bar C group right there. And he became outspoken about the monopoly that the barons held on the rangeland. And he began writing about it. And he was a well-educated man. He was from West Virginia. He was said to be quite big compared to other men for his time. That's one of the reasons I questioned this photo, but it serves for us to look at somebody for this. And he was nice-looking, kind of roguish, very outspoken. He became good friends with Nate Champion while they both worked together on the Bar C. And once Jack Flagg helped to organize a strike when all of the barons got together and lowered wages for all the cowhands. Jack Flagg helped that strike to be successful. And so he became the number one name on the blacklist. Jack Flagg's life was actually in danger because of his stance. I wish I had a picture of this next man to talk about, but I don't think there's one in existence. His name is Sumner Beach. He also worked for the Bar C, a friend of Nate Champion, a friend to Jack Flagg. And Sumner left the Bar C, traveled south, and went down into the Sweetwater River Basin, and he worked for a man named, and here I'm going to pause for a moment, because this is one of those names I want you to remember. He worked for a man named Frank Walcott. I'm going to tell you a lot more about Walcott in just a moment. So he was a cowhand for Walcott down on the Sweetwater. And while he was there working for him, Sumner Beach saw this one little piece of land that just charmed him. And he wanted to take out a claim there. Now, this was part of the grazing land that Mr. Walcott used. So Sumner took out that claim. In those days, you could make a claim for by using the Homestead Act, in which you could get 160 acres. And then there was the Desert Land Entry Act. You could get 4 times that. So Sumner took out a claim, all legal, and he got a partner to help him because he's going to build a cabin there. And he and his partner go up into the slopes and cut some timber, drag it down into their cabin site, debark it, stack it up to cure it. First time they go into town, into Buffalo, to buy supplies, they come back and there are no logs. All they find are drag marks where the logs have been skidded into the creek, and they're gone. The culprit here was the man he had worked for, Mr. Walcott. So what did Sumner do? Well, let me tell you about Mr. Walcott first. There he is, Frank Walcott. You've got to hear his background to understand this man. He fought in the Civil War for the Union, and for his service, he became a major. For his service, President Grant awarded him the title of United States Marshal in the Wyoming Territory. And then when he stopped that job, he was offered the wardenship at the federal prison in Laramie. You think about your resume. Those look pretty good. United States Marshal, warden of a prison. Well, he was dismissed from both of them. And I'm going to read you the quote that was written in the official papers as to why he was let go. Here it goes. Walcott, quote, embezzled money, was obnoxious, overbearing, hateful, abusive, insolent, dishonest, corrupt, disgraceful, end quote. Walcott was the kind of man who, when someone took out a claim on a piece of land and he didn't want him there, he would go to the land agent and arrange it so that the land agent showed that Walcott had already taken a claim on that land, and it was all a big mistake. So he was willing to be dishonest in that way to keep his own free range. When Sumner Beach started building his cabin again, he went up and got more logs and prepared them. This time, Walcott took another ploy. He sent an old acquaintance of Sumner's who had worked for the Bar C, a man named Bill Locker. He sent Locker there to kill Sumner Beach. So Locker showed up and said, "How about I help you boys with your cabin?" Sumner Beach had always been suspicious of him, had never liked him, but for whatever reason allowed him to stay and help out. But he always kept one eye on him. And when that time came when Locker tried to do the devilish deed, Sumner was too quick for him and killed him in self-defense. Frank Walcott had a warrant taken out for Sumner Beach. Sumner was taken into town, put in jail, and then listen to this. Frank Walcott had himself appointed Justice of the Peace to oversee the trial. And that's what happened. So Sumner goes into trial, but something remarkable happens at that point, and it's something that's still a mystery to historians. You see the text here where it says, Frank Walcott, Jack of Spades. This is the text from a pamphlet that someone wrote up and someone printed up. A good guess might be that it was Jack Flagg, but I don't know this for a fact. And this exposes everything about Walcott's past. And so now all of the townspeople, including the people in the jury, have been enlightened about what kind of man Walcott is. The jury was out for less than 15 minutes, and they came back in and said not guilty because of self-defense. There was something coming much more dangerous, much more lethal than a lone assassin. This summer of 1886 was very, very dry, and the grass was in very poor shape. When winter came along, the worst thing possible happened for all the ranchers. It's called the Big Die-Up. It was the worst winter on history in Wyoming. The temperature plummeted to 60 below zero. You had snow, standing up several feet high. Cattle don't know how to deal with that. Cattle don't know how to get down through the snow to get at any grass that might be there. But in this case, what grass was there after the terrible summer? So we had 50% of all the cattle in the Wyoming territory died that winter, froze to death. Some of them froze standing up. There were cattle jams of bodies in ice in the rivers. Think of a log jam, but replace the logs with frozen cattle. It was horrific. The Big Die-Up killed hundreds of thousands of cattle. Many companies just went under. Many cow hands were fired, let go because no need for them anymore. Many of the small ranchers called it quits. This winter had been too much for them. But in their place came some tougher stock. Part of the story of the Johnson County fiasco centers around these two people. You may have heard before, maybe just in passing, in reading some history, coming across a story about a person named Cattle Kate, an infamous woman who was a prostitute, and she sold her sexual favors for stolen cattle. This was down in the history books for decades. This is the way she was remembered. It's not true. This woman was not ever a prostitute. Her name was Ella Watson. And the man that she loved was Jim Averill. Let me tell you about them. Jim came from Wisconsin. He'd served in the Army. He'd actually been on duty at Fort McKinney up near Buffalo, Wyoming. And when he went out on his own, he decided to become a merchant in an isolated place where he could provide sales for people who had a hard time getting back into town. So he built himself an inn/tavern/restaurant on the Oregon Trail right off the Sweetwater River. He met Ella at the claim office in Casper. Ella was there also to take out a claim. They fell in love and decided to get married, but they would delay that marriage so that they could each take out a claim, and then after they were married, they would join those two together. So that's what they did. Let me tell you about Ella. She was a Scotswoman, a real pistol. Great sense of humor, kind of lively person, very kind-hearted. And we know that because she took in teenage boys who had been thrown out of their families. Just troubled kids. And sometimes they worked for Jim at the inn, or they worked for Ella. Ella did accumulate a small amount of cattle. That transaction happened because a cattleman was driving his trail along the Oregon Trail, and his cattle were footsore, and the man couldn't move them anymore. So Ella bought them cheap from him. That's the way she got her cattle. Well, a neighbor who wanted her land. In fact, he had already fenced in her land for himself. So the fencing was removed when she made out her claim. But he wanted that land back. And so he got a wagon and 5 neighbors and went over to Jim Averill's store where Ella was cooking, and he kidnapped both of them. Why Jim? Because Jim, who was an educated man, had been, just like Jack Flagg, had been writing articles for the newspaper about the monopoly of the cattle barons. So they took both of them in the wagon, and they drove them. See the bottom right picture? That is the tree from which both of them were hung, just to get rid of them. They were left hanging there until their bodies turned black. That's how they were found, in the hot sun. The man behind it is the man seated on the left, Albert Bothwell. I'll tell you, once you know somebody's true character, it's easy to look at them and say, yeah, well, you can see that. Look at that man's face. He looks like one of the sternest men ever to walk the planet. So he's a killer. And when he kidnapped Jim and Ella, there were 3 youth there. 2 of them were 2 of those teenagers that Ella had taken in. And one was a young man working for Jim Averill. And that young man, when he saw what was happening, he jumped on his horse and went after him. He was worried about them. All he had in the way of a weapon was his sidearm, and he had it loaded fully, but he didn't have any more ammunition. So he went off unprepared for this. He didn't know what was going to happen. But when he got down to this gulch where they were pushed off the side to hang by strangulation, this is not a hanging like snapping the neck. This is having your hands free and trying to pull on the rope so that you can breathe until you fatigue so that you can't do it any longer. It's a torture. So this young man's name's Frank Buchanan, opens fire on these men. And they fight back, of course. And they've got him outnumbered. He's only got so many bullets, and he has to retreat. But he's a witness to it. He saw what happened. Those 3 young men disappeared, never seen again. One story about one of the young boys is that Bothwell's wife brought a custard over as a gift of bereavement for their losses, and the custard was poisoned. But they were never seen again. In 1889, Wyoming Territory becomes a state. Nate Champion has been fired from the Bar C. Here's why. Nate allowed the blacklisted small ranchers to participate in the spring roundup over which he was foreman for all the ranches. And the WSGA put him on their blacklist because of that. He was fired. And one of the people who was instrumental in getting him fired because of that, do you remember that man, Fred Hess? You saw his picture. He was the one born poor who worked for the cattle barons. He was the foreman for that rich man, Morton Fruin, that you saw. So Nate was on his own, but he had made enough money now so that he was able to buy some cattle. He owned 140 head, and he ran them in the hole-in-the-wall country. That's an interesting piece of geology there, where you've got these long cliffs of red stone, and in the middle of it, this long corridor of wonderful grass. So it was free range, federal land. So Nate ran there with his cattle. And this is where Nate had his first physical run-in with one of the WSGA men. And here he is. Remember this guy, because he is going to play a key part in the final resolution of this story. Mike Chauncey was a spy for the WSGA. He also served as a foreman for one of the senators who was a cattle baron and owned a big spread. Chauncey was also running cattle in Hole in the Wall. And as often happens out on the range, this is not uncommon at all, herds can get intermixed a little bit. And all that's needed is for the cowhands to cut out their cattle and separate them again. Well, this happened with Nate's herd. Nate had his crew with him, and Chauncey had his crew. And Nate rode over to talk to Chauncey. He didn't have a good opinion of Chauncey to begin with, and here's why. Chauncey had been caught by Jack Flagg over-branding Flagg's brand on cattle. He was stealing Jack Flagg's cattle. They called it in those days blotching. You blotched a brand that was already present, changing it into another brand. Jack Flagg caught Chauncey doing that and whipped him with his quirt in front of his crew. And Chauncey didn't fight back. He just took it. So he lost a lot of standing, I'm sure, among his peers. The same thing is about to happen again with Nate Champion, but without the whipping. When Nate goes over to talk to Chauncey and tell them, we need to cut these cattle apart, so I'm going in here to get mine, and Chauncey says, just give me some time here and we'll be glad to get those for you. We'll bring your cattle back over for you. So Nate takes him at his word and goes back to his crew. The next time Nate sees his cattle, they've been shooed up the hillsides across the creek, going up the mountains. So he has to go up there and bring them back in. He rides over to Chauncey by himself. Chauncey's there with his whole crew. And Nate says to him, now I see you for what you are, and I know how to deal with you in the future because you're a liar. Chauncey just took it. All his men were there with him to hear that. When this happened a second time with another rancher, Nate Champion was number 2 on that blacklist. So you can think of that blacklist as one of maybe just a disparaging list, but it also served as a hit list. So Jack Flagg was number 1 on that list. Nate Champion was number 2. So their days were numbered. If you had asked a WSGA man, that's what he would have said. This man, Will Van Devanter, was the main chief attorney for the cattle barons. He was very involved in different government posts. Listen to some of these. Member of the Wyoming legislature. Chief Justice of the Wyoming Supreme Court. And he will, in the future, become a Assistant U.S. Attorney General. He plants a spy inside Nate's crew because he wants to have real evidence that he can take to court. And after that spy spent time with Nate and reported back to him, those words there are what Van Devanter reported to the WSGA. There is absolutely no proof of any kind against him, meaning Nate Champion, that not even that he stole a calf. Jack Flagg and his neighbors bring their cattle together to make a drive to a railroad depot for sales. Fred Hess intercepts them. Fred Hess says, I am now the head of the Northern Wyoming Protective Agency. This is simply an assignment by the WSGA. They made up this agency. And he says, I'm holding all of your cattle because you have no proof they are yours. What that means is, he's really saying, because you're not WSGA members. So this is when things are starting to get heated up now. And the small ranchers are starting to get more organized to try to have their own kind of power to fight against the WSGA. Nate is staying in a very small cabin. It's called the Hall cabin. An old man named Hall had lived there. That cabin is no longer in existence, but this is the size of it. That's why I chose this picture. The room was so small, the one-room building is so small, it's got a stove in there and one bed. The door won't open all the way because it hits the bedpost. Now, Nate is staying there with two roommates. One fella is working for him. His name is Ross Gilbertson. And the other roommate is a cat. So one morning, Nate has awakened, but he's still lying in bed and he's stroking the cat. Ross is asleep right next to him in the bed. And little did Nate or Ross know, but in the night, 5 men had gathered a short distance from that cabin and waited for dawn. And right at daybreak, these 5 men, all of them stock detectives, they all start bursting into the cabin. They have no idea that the door won't open all the way. So only one man can fit through. He's got his gun out. And I know that their plan was to hang these 2 men, just like Jim Averill and Ella Watson. When you leave a body hanging like that, there's an object lesson given. And the reason I know that was their goal is because the man that came in with his gun out, instead of shooting, he said, "Give it up, boys, we got you this time." So Nate didn't know what in the world was going on. And he said, "Who are you and what do you want?" And the man started to talk, and Nate pretended to stretch. His gun belt was hanging over the bedpost, and he drew his gun. The man in the door shot. The bullet passed right past Nate's face. He had powder burns on his face from it. Nate shot and hit his target. And the 5 men were falling over themselves trying to get out of there, making a run for it. Nate jumps out of bed, steps out in his long johns and socks with his pistol, and first thing he sees are 2 rifles lying on the ground. These men had panicked and dropped their rifles and ran for it. And he recognized one rifle. It belonged to Frank Canton. Remember him? Alias Joe Horner, outlaw turned stock detective. So Nate picks up a rifle for better accuracy to go after these guys. And at that moment, one of those men had stayed behind. He steps out from the corner of the building. He's armed with a rifle. Nate leaps back through the door. Now, this is one of those moments when being small is a good thing. Nate got right through that crack in the door, and he shot through the log cabin, through the chinking at this man. And he looked out the window to see what was going on, and he saw a man hobbling away holding his gut. So Nate and Ross get dressed, and they trail these 5 men. It's easy tracking because they're following blood. And they get to a place where they see the ground is trampled by horses' hooves. This is where the men had huddled before dawn. And guess what was lying on the ground here? A stack of overcoats. You know they'd been huddled in them overnight, and then when they decided to go for the assassination, everybody took their coat off for more agility, I guess, piled it up. They left them there. The horses were gone. Nate was ready to go after him to get his horse, but Ross said to him, "Nate, this is just not my kind of game. I'm not up for this." So Nate knew that he had to go get help. So he rode to the Red Fork of the Powder River, where he had several friends living. And one of those is this man, who lived in the same town with Nate in Texas. John Tisdale was known as the most educated young man in Williamson County, Texas. He was the only person there at his age to go to college. And everyone had great respect for him. He was a good friend of Nate, and he respected Nate. So he went to his homestead, and that's the actual picture of the Tisdale homestead there. And Mr. Tisdale has a wife and 2 children, and yet he wants to help Nate, so he saddles up. Nate also gets his little brother Dudley to go along. And then another party whose name is Ranger Jones. Great name, Ranger Jones. His real name was Orley, O-R-L-E-Y. I think he liked Ranger better. Ranger Jones joined them. So they gallop off, a self-made posse, and start tracking these men. And they track them to a little place called Beaver Creek Canyon. And when they arrive there, the timing just couldn't have been better. They find 5 horses and Mike Chauncey, that spy for the WSGA. So here's what had happened. The 5 assassins had brought 5 extra horses and left them there at Beaver Creek Canyon in case things went awry and they needed to get away from Nate Champion. So when they had made their run from Nate's cabin, they left their spent horses there and took the fresh horses and kept going. Chauncey was sent back to get those spent horses. And at the same moment that Nate shows up. There was also a tarp there, and the tarp was just covered with blood. And that's where the gunshot victim or victims had lain down while these men were trying to get them out of there. So Nate did something very clever. Think about it. If you're Mike Chauncey, Mike Chauncey was in on this group. He was one of the ones who came to assassinate Nate. So Nate says to Chauncey, I already know the name of every man who was in your party trying to kill me, but I want to hear it from your mouth. And if you lie to me, I'll kill you. Think about that for a moment. There was no choice, was there? Chauncey had to reveal those names. And when he did reveal those names, there were witnesses there. Nate, John Tisdale, Nate's little brother Dudley, and Ranger Jones. Keep that in mind. They were witnesses. The man who stepped out from the cabin and surprised Nate, his name was Joe Elliott. He was a stock detective. Nate had never met him before, but he saw him. So he had a face to identify. So this would go to court later, but it would never go to fruition. And you'll find out why. Because the main witness will not be there anymore. So the WSGA makes a startling plan. The man you see on the right is the treasurer of the WSGA, Billy Irvine. It is said that he is the only person of all the WSGA members who could stand being with Frank Walcott. That was his only friend. Irvine was his only friend, apparently. Irvine, being the treasurer, and Walcott, being one of the heads of the WSGA, put together a plan to raise a private army, and they're going to hire killers from Texas. They send a man named Tom Smith, who is a Texan, to go back down to Texas to gather murders. And interestingly, he doesn't go to Fort Worth, he doesn't go to Abilene or Dallas, he goes to Paris, Texas. He must know something about that community. And he comes back with 25 paid killers. Now they're offered brand new weapons, Winchester rifles, pistols, $5 a day, $50 bonus for every person killed. They'll be provided with horses, and the plan is that they, along with 27 others from Wyoming, this would be cowhands who work for the barons who were forced to go into this army. And you also had a handful of the elite come along just because they wanted to see the action. There was even a newspaper man who came along so he could write about it. And he promised Frank Walcott, I'll write this in your favor, don't worry. The plan was to bring these men up to Cheyenne, and then a special train provided by the Union Pacific which means that that railroad company was in cahoots with this whole plan. They ran a secret run from Cheyenne to Casper to deliver men, horses, wagons, food supplies, and dynamite. And listen to this plan. They're going to march from Casper to Buffalo, Wyoming, and they're going to kill 70 people on a list. Jack Flagg was first on that list, Nate Champion next, and so on. And they were going to use the dynamite to blow up several buildings. They were going to kill sheriffs, deputies, county commissioners, judges, editors who had written against them. Let me read to you a little section from the Wyoming State Constitution, Section 6, Article 19. No armed body of men shall ever be brought into this state for the suppression of domestic violence. So these men were breaking federal law in doing this. They raised $100,000 for this army. If you transpose that into today's time, you're talking $2.5 million. In that same month that Nate and Ross were attacked in the cabin, John Tisdale was assassinated, shot in the back, while driving his wagon back to his home with Christmas gifts for his children. Ranger Jones was shot in the back while driving a wagon away from town with a load of lumber to build a home for his new bride and himself. Those assassinations were just the beginning. This army was going to finish off quite a few more people. Now Nate is staying, headquartering at Johnny Nolan's old cabin called the KC Ranch. There's a town in Wyoming today called Kaycee, KC, named after this place. This cabin no longer exists, and you'll soon understand why. But this is a beautiful duplicate of it. Same size, same storeroom in the back, windows. So it's a good one for us to look at to hear this story. Nate has a partner named Nick Ray, big guy, kind of a robust, funny guy. People liked him, strong. They're staying there together at the Nolan cabin, and they have no idea that this army, this mercenary army, is marching up north from Casper on the way to Buffalo. Now, KC is not on the way to Buffalo, so they're going to get missed in this unless something changes that. While Nate is out on his horse one day, he runs across two old acquaintances who were cowhands that he had known, and now they're out of work, so they're trying to be trappers. And he tells them, the weather's going to turn very bad now. Why don't you guys come stay at our cabin? So they take him up on it. They go to his cabin. One of the old guys, the trappers, is a fiddler, so they have some fun that night with some music and some dancing and some singing. A knock comes on the door. Of all people, it's a big blizzard going on out there now. It's Mike Chauncey, this spy. And this is where he plays this huge part in the fate of Nate Champion. He comes there out, begging for mercy from the weather. And this tells us more about Nate Champion, who opens his door and allows him to come in. The next morning, when everybody gets up, Chauncey's gone. Not a word of thank you, no note, anything. What he's done now, he knows about the army coming. He starts riding hard to intercept the army. And he wants to tell Frank Walcott that you can get Nate Champion and Nick Ray and get this, 15 other rustlers if you head right now to the KC. So Walcott and his men are in this horrible blizzard. I mean, it is bad conditions, and they're really suffering. And Walcott wants to make this big detour to go take care of Nate Champion. And let me tell you why. It's probably enough to say that Nate was number 2 on that list, but something else happened. The small ranchers, unknown to Nate, they met together in Buffalo and they formed a brand new organization called the Northern Wyoming Farmers and Stock Growers Association. And it's simply an organization to help fight back against the cattle barons, the WSGA. And guess who they elected as president? Nate Champion. He had no idea. This put Nate number 1 on the blacklist. This is why Walcott wanted to go wipe him out first. So the next morning, Nate and Nick get up. They're making breakfast for these 2 trappers. The old trapper, Ben Jones, he grabs a bucket and says, I'll go down to the river and get some water. 20 minutes later, he hasn't come back. So his buddy, Billy Walker, younger guy, says, let me go look for Ben. He goes out, and he doesn't come back. What they don't know is that army has surrounded the cabin during the nighttime. You've got 52 men with Winchester rifles surrounding this cabin. Nate looks out the window and he sees some movement here. This is the actual stable that's 75 yards out in front of the cabin. He sees movement here. So when Nick goes to the door and says, let me go see what's happened to these 2 guys, Nate said, well, be careful, because I thought I saw more than 2 heads in there in the stable. And so Nick steps out, and as soon as he steps out, this one fella who was given permission by Frank Walcott to be the first one to shoot, who calls himself the Texas Kid, he shoots Nick in the chest. And then all the other rifles open up on him. Nick falls down. He's crawling to get back into the cabin, and Nate opens the door, has his gun, and see what is going on out there, and he sees what's happened, and bullets just hit the door, so he slams the door shut. You'll never guess what he does next. No one would have expected this. He opens that door and rushes out there, and he drags Nick Ray inside. Think what that took to do that. Bullets whizzing everywhere by him. So now Nate has a dying man to take care of, and he has to defend the cabin. So he's helping Nick and going to the windows and firing to hold these men at bay. But he does a third thing, and this is the thing that makes Nate Champion stand out in history. Nate keeps a diary in living time of what's happening. He writes down everything that's going on. I believe he's writing to his brothers in this because of the last line in here, which I'll read to you later. But he holds them off for 8 hours. During that time, these Texans and the other Wyoming members of the Army have come to respect Nate's ability with a Winchester rifle. He's already shot 3 men, maybe more. Nate is not hit, but you can imagine what that cabin looked like. There probably wasn't a piece of glass left in a window. Bullets flying in there all the time, hitting frying pans on the wall, who knows what, bedposts. A wagon appears on the main road heading up toward the bridge that's going to cross the middle fork of the Powder River. Nate does not get a good chance to look at them. He can't see who they are. It's a wagon with 1 driver and a horseman behind. None of the Army know who it is either. Well, it's Jack Flagg on horseback and his stepson in the wagon in front. And they don't know what's going on. And when Jack, he yells out to his stepson, let's get going. And he puts his heels to his horse, and the reins snap on those horses on the wagon, and they take off, and they are not hit. And Texans jump on their horses to chase after them. And they're in such a hurry, they left their rifles behind. They just took their sidearms. One of the horses pulling the wagon was hit. And so they have to stop eventually before a mile. And Jack instructs his stepson, Alonzo, cut out the good horse, get on it bareback, and we're going to Buffalo to spread the word about what's happening here with Nate's cabin. Then those Texans show up. All they have are pistols. And Jack shows them his Winchester. He shows it to them. So they stop 1,000 yards away. They empty their pistols at him at 1,000 yards. Nothing. But they don't come any closer because of that rifle. So Jack and his stepson get away to spread the word. The Texans come in and take the wagon back because they've got an idea. They've got an idea to make a go devil, a moving fortress. It's also called the Ark of Safety. If you can make out those words down there on the bottom right corner, that's what that says. This comes from that very episode. So they take this cabin back and they start splitting fence posts that are stacked up inside the barn. Now in that country, that's going to be pitch pine and juniper. And when you burn those two woods, it makes a caustic, acrid, black smoke. So they're filling up a wagon. They've outfitted the wagon as protection so that they can push it toward the cabin. And they've covered all the fence posts with hay and put more fence posts on. It was a bonfire waiting to happen. They pushed it up to the cabin while the other army members were laying siege to the windows to keep Nate out of the window. And they lighted it. At 4 o'clock, the cabin caught on fire. Now, Nate had already made a plan in his mind, probably, to make a run for it in the night. I mean, who wouldn't? But now he sees he's got to push all that up. Now, he's got these choices. He can surrender and be hanged. He can stay in the cabin and burn to death. He can go out shooting and be shot dead. Or he could just try to sprint and make a run for it. Only one of those has any hope to it at all, and that's the last one. So that's his plan. He takes off his boots, and he's waiting for some opportunity. He's peeking out the window when he can. And then something interesting happens. The wind shifts. The wind comes out of the north, and it blows all the smoke. The cabin's completely on fire. And Nate is hovering low to stay out of the heat as well as he can. When he peeks out the window, he sees all of that smoke billowing out the back, so he takes off in his socks, sprints. He's got 75 yards or to 100 yards to a gulch, a little gully. And the gully's full of brush, so he could get in there and hide, maybe wiggle out of there. He's running through the smoke, and bullets are whizzing because somebody has yelled out, "There he goes!" And he's not hit. He makes it to the gulch. And as soon as he's there, he finds 2 men waiting on him. And they kill him. He's hit at least 11 times. And he's dead. All of the army comes down because they want to see the corpse of this man. There's probably not a man there who didn't have respect for Nate Champion. And when they found out he was a Texan, you can imagine how the feelings ran on that. Frank Walcott, who never complimented any of this army men, he loathed these army men that he had hired because they weren't tough enough for him. They kept complaining about the blizzard. So he stood there over Nate Champion's body and he said, "If I had 50 men like him, I could whip the whole state of Wyoming." He said, "Pin a note on his chest." So somebody went down and put a note that said, "Cattle thieves beware," pinned it to Nate's vest. And when he did that, he found that diary that Nate had stuffed behind his vest. Frank Walcott took it and read it to everybody present. Can you imagine what that was like? How quiet it was as that man read from Nate Champion's journal. The last line of that journal was, "Goodbye, boys, if I never see you again." This is a statue that was done by Michael Thomas that celebrates Nate Champion's ordeal and bravery. Only one flaw with this. It's a wonderful statue, and I do admire it. Only one historical flaw is that he's got his boots on. I guess it looks better. The end of the story happens here at the TA Ranch. The army has moved on the way to Buffalo now. But Buffalo has been alerted by Jack Flagg, and they've organized an army of 300. 300 against 52. So that army marches south, and they hold Walcott's men up at the TA Ranch. Walcott instructs one of the men to get through during the dark, to send a wire to the governor. The governor was a member of the WSGA. And the governor wired Washington, D.C. The senators there, who were members of the WSGA, then went to the president's staff. This is Benjamin Harrison. And the staff woke up the president of the United States in order to release a unit from Fort McKinney in Buffalo to come down and save the lives of these cattle barons. And the message was, rustlers have taken over the territory. So the cavalry is sent down there. This is the most ludicrous example ever in the history of the Old West, in my opinion, of the cavalry coming to the rescue. They rescued the wrong people. They took these rich cattle barons back where they were safe inside of a fort and could not be gotten to for any kind of legal charges. This is about half of Walcott's army. They posed for this photograph. The laser doesn't work on this screen, so I can't point people out to you, but maybe that's just as well, because I'm sure I've gone over time. But Walcott is there, Billy Irvine, Mike Chauncey is there, Fred Hess, Frank Canton, they're all part of that. There have been some tributes to Nate Champion. Plaques, some of these at the Jim Gatchell Museum in Buffalo, some right along the highway where Nate was killed. It's hard for me to believe that my 2 books on Nate Champion are the first books on Nate Champion. He's in a lot of books, a lot of history books. There might be a few pages about him, or there might be a paragraph about him. But this man deserves a lot more than that. And I'd like to read to you my favorite tribute to him. It was spoken over his grave when he and Nick Ray were buried in Buffalo. The pastor who oversaw the funeral proceedings said this to everyone gathered. These 2 men are now with our Maker, no doubt given a hero's welcome by all who hailed from Wyoming. We know Nate and Nick were good men, far from criminal. They were peace-loving men who, by their example, inspired the best of who we are. This morning, I overheard 3 different women profess to their children, quote, if you can live up to the likes of Nate Champion, you will make a mother proud and leave your mark. Now, I'm a composer, and I have to write about things that inspire me. So I want to play for you a song that I wrote for Nate Champion. It's called Goodbye, Boys, If I Never See You Again. I left my folks in Texas to find my way up to heaven's gate. It's all I've ever wanted, and I found it beneath the Wyoming sky. place I can call my own, a place for to build me a home. My name has stood for something, but now they call me a rustler. There ain't one calf that I've stolen, and I told them, but they don't want to hear. Well, I was taught better than that, to know the good from the bad in a man. So try and take me, you'll never break me, because I know I'm in the right. But here you lying, you're trying to make me out a thief in the night. So keep your distance and mind your business. You can be sure I'll mind my own. But if you cheat me, try to defeat me, you'll have a fight that cuts to the bone. I've never claimed more than what's mine. No, I've never crossed over that line. Now I'm as much Wyoming as any man to set foot here. If you try and buy me out or drive me out, you'll find I'm a man of my word. But by then it might be too late, 'cause you know there'll be hell to pay. So try and take me, God won't forsake me. I can surely use a friend. I'm feeling lonely because I'm only just one man against 50 men. And if you take me, incinerate me, and let my ashes blow to the wind, remember my voice, I'll say goodbye, boys, if I never see you again. Now I'll say goodbye to my friends if I never see you again.
Let's give a round of applause to Mr. Mark Warren.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mark. Mark will be available for questions at the table to the left. He's also has about 20 books for sale and available for signing. They are historical fiction as well as novels. So please make your way to the table if you'd like to have any discussion with Mark or to purchase any books or receive any book signings. Thank you for joining us for Art for Lunch.